On the 5th of December 1933, the United States did something it had never done before and has never done since. It repealed a constitutional amendment. For 13 years, it had been illegal to manufacture or sell alcohol anywhere in America. And in those 13 years, that single law had built the largest criminal economy the country had ever seen. One man in Chicago was pulling in an estimated $100 million a year, well over $1 billion in today's money, from liquor, breweries, speakeasies, and everything attached to them. Then, in one afternoon, the product became legal. Think about what that means as a business problem. Overnight, your entire industry is handed to licensed competitors who can advertise, who pay taxes, who don't need to bribe anybody, and who will never have to shoot a rival over a delivery route. The margins are gone. The barrier to entry that made you rich, the fact that it was a crime, has been abolished by Congress. Every reasonable person at the time expected that to be the end of them. It was not the end of them. Within 20 years, the American Mafia would be more powerful than it had ever been during Prohibition. It would control the concrete in New York, the garbage on Long Island, the docks on 2 coasts, the garment industry, and a growing share of the trucking that moved goods across the country. It would own casinos in a state that had legalized gambling. It would sit on top of union pension funds, holding hundreds of millions of dollars. It would have a national governing body, settling disputes between cities. None of that existed in 1920. So the question this video is actually about is not how the Mafia survived losing alcohol. It is why losing alcohol made them stronger. This is what happened to the Mafia after Prohibition ended. To understand what repeal did, you have to understand what these men were before 1920. And the honest answer is, not very much. Before Prohibition, criminal gangs in American cities existed on the periphery. That is the phrase historians use, and it is accurate. They were neighborhood operations. Italian, Irish, Jewish, Polish, organized along ethnic lines, working the blocks they came from, doing street-level work. Extortion of local shopkeepers, loan sharking, burglary, robbery, small gambling rackets, contract violence for hire. Above them sat the real power, which was political. Big city machine bosses controlled votes neighborhood by neighborhood, and they financed that control partly with payments from the men running gambling and vice, and with bribes to keep police looking the other way. So the criminals were not at the top of anything. They were suppliers to the political machine, useful, disposable, and local. There was no national organization. There was no coordination between cities. There was nothing you could reasonably call an enterprise. There were gangs. Then, in January of 1920, the federal government made alcohol illegal in a country of 100 million people who had absolutely no intention of stopping. Understand what Prohibition actually was from a business perspective. It was the creation of a guaranteed mass market in a product that is cheap to make and easy to move, with universal demand across every class and region, and with all legal competition removed by law. There has never been a commercial opportunity like it, before or since. And here is the part that matters, because it is the thing everyone gets wrong about this period. The money was not the important part. The important part was what they had to build in order to collect the money, because you cannot supply an entire country with an illegal product using a neighborhood gang. Alcohol is bulky. It has to be manufactured somewhere, or smuggled across a border, or diverted from industrial supply. It has to be warehoused. It has to be transported over long distances, on public roads, past police. It has to be distributed to thousands of retail outlets. Money has to be collected from all of them and moved back up the chain. Disputes over territory have to be settled because a war interrupts supply. And interrupted supply means losing customers to a rival. In other words, Prohibition forced American criminals to build a logistics company. They needed trucks and drivers. They needed warehouses. They needed accountants. They needed relationships with police departments in multiple jurisdictions and with politicians who could keep those relationships stable. They needed working agreements with gangs in other cities because product moved between states. They needed a way to resolve conflict that did not automatically become a war. By the end of the 20s, Al Capone's operation in Chicago alone was estimated at around $100 million a year across liquor, brewing, speakeasies, gambling, and vice. But the $100 million was the output. The machine that produced it was the asset. And a machine that can move whiskey can move anything. Now here is the part of the story that is almost never told properly, and it is the reason repeal did not destroy them. Every single thing the Mafia needed to survive the end of Prohibition was already in place before Prohibition ended. Look at what happened in 1931, 2 years before repeal. First, the state of Nevada legalized gambling. Not the Mafia's doing. Nevada was broke, the Depression was on, and legal gaming was a revenue measure. But the effect was immediate and enormous. There was now one place in the United States where you could run a casino lawfully. And there was a very large amount of Prohibition cash in America, looking for somewhere to go. Underworld money began flowing into Nevada hotels and casinos, laundered through brokers, and reinvested, with the men who had made it during the 20s taking positions in a legal industry. Second, in that same year, Charles Luciano ended the wars between the New York families and built something entirely new. He abolished the idea of a single boss of all bosses. He divided New York into 5 families with fixed territories. And he created a commission, a governing panel of the heads of the major families, which would arbitrate disputes, approve or forbid killings, and prevent the kind of open warfare that had been destroying business. That is not a gang. That is a constitution. And it was written while the money was still coming in, by men who had learned during Prohibition exactly how expensive chaos is. Third, in October of 1931, Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion. The most famous criminal in America went to prison, and the Chicago outfit passed to men most people had never heard of and never would. Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, quiet operators who kept their names out of the papers and kept the organization running. So by the end of 1931, 2 years before the money disappeared, the American Mafia had a legal industry to move into, a national structure to coordinate through, and a demonstration of exactly what happens to a boss who becomes famous. They were ready. Most of them did not know it yet. Then came the 5th of December, 1933. The 21st Amendment was ratified. Alcohol was legal. The single largest revenue stream in the history of American organized crime evaporated in a day. Some of them went straight. A number of former bootleggers took their capital and their distribution networks and entered the licensed liquor business, which is what you do when you already own trucks and warehouses and know every bar owner in the city. It was legal, it was safe, and it was dramatically less profitable because now you paid tax. And now anybody could compete with you. The rest went in a different direction entirely, and they went in 4 directions at once. Gambling first, because gambling never stopped being illegal. The numbers rackets in particular, cheap daily lottery games, run in poor neighborhoods, taking pennies from enormous numbers of people. In New York, Dutch Schultz consolidated control of the Harlem Numbers operation. It was not glamorous. It produced a steady river of cash from people who had almost nothing, in the middle of the worst economic collapse in American history. Loan sharking second, and the Depression is the reason. Banks had failed. Credit had vanished. Millions of people needed money and could not get it from any legitimate institution. The Mafia had cash reserves from 13 years of bootlegging and no shortage of men willing to collect. Usury became one of the most reliable businesses they had, precisely because everybody else was broke. Extortion third, protection payments squeezed out of small businesses that were already failing. And narcotics fourth, which was the natural continuation of the same work. Smuggling is smuggling. The routes, the contacts, the corrupt officials, and the distribution networks built for whiskey worked perfectly well for heroin. But none of those four is the real answer to what happened after Prohibition. The real answer is labor. Here is the fact that reframes the entire decade. In 1932, a year before repeal, the president of the Chicago Crime Commission publicly asserted that Al Capone controlled 2/3 of the unions in the city of Chicago. 2/3. Before the alcohol money was even gone. The infiltration had started during Prohibition for a simple operational reason. If you are moving illegal liquor by truck across a city, you need the Teamsters not to interfere. If you are brewing beer at scale, you need the brewery workers not to talk. The easiest way to guarantee both is to control their unions. So they did. And once you are inside a union, the opportunities multiply in every direction. You can extort employers by threatening a strike that would financially destroy them. You can take payments from those same employers to guarantee labor peace. You can embezzle the dues. You can create no-show jobs for your own men. You can take kickbacks on contracts. You can fix prices across an entire industry by controlling who is allowed to work in it. And then, at exactly the moment alcohol became legal, something happened that made all of that vastly more valuable. The New Deal. Under Roosevelt's legislation, American workers gained real legal protections for organizing, and union membership exploded. It went from around 3 million members in 1933 to roughly 9 million by the end of the decade. Tripled. In 7 years, the Mafia had spent the 20s quietly taking positions inside the American labor movement in order to protect a whiskey business. And then the whiskey business ended, and the federal government proceeded to triple the size of the thing they had taken over. They did not pivot into labor racketeering after repeal. They were already there. Repeal simply removed the distraction and the pension funds those unions would accumulate over the following decades. The money working men paid in every week for their retirement would eventually be lent out to build a city in the Nevada desert. There is one more story from these years, and it is the one that tells you what had actually changed in these men's heads. In 1930, in the depths of the Depression, Al Capone opened a soup kitchen on South State Street in Chicago. It fed thousands of unemployed people. It was transparently public relations. He handed it over to an established charity after a few weeks, but according to accounts of the period, running it taught him something. And he said it out loud. "You have to have a product," he reportedly said, "that everybody needs every single day. We do not have that in booze." His answer was milk. Every family, every day wants it on the table. And by the following spring, the Chicago outfit had reportedly moved into the milk business. That story should be treated with some caution, because it comes down to us through recollection rather than record. And Capone was a man who said a great many things. But it is repeated by serious writers on the period, and it is worth sitting with because of what it reveals. That is not a gangster talking. That is a man doing market analysis. He is not thinking about territory or respect or revenge. He is thinking about demand frequency and margin stability. He is thinking like someone who runs a company and has noticed that his current product has a structural problem. 13 years earlier, the men who became the American Mafia were neighborhood extortionists, working blocks they grew up on. By 1930, One of them was talking about consumer staples. So what happened to the Mafia after Prohibition ended? They lost their biggest product and kept everything else. They kept the trucks and the warehouses. They kept the accountants. They kept the police captains and the aldermen and the judges. They kept the working relationships between cities. They kept the commission, which had been built 2 years before they needed it. They kept a very large amount of cash at a moment when almost nobody in America had any. And most importantly, they kept their positions inside the unions, which were about to triple in size. Prohibition is remembered as the thing that made the Mafia rich. It did. But that is not why it mattered. Prohibition is what made the Mafia organized. It forced a collection of ethnic street gangs to become a coordinated national enterprise with logistics, political protection, dispute resolution, and interstate agreements. Because nothing less than that could supply alcohol to an entire country. The alcohol was temporary. The organization was not. That structure, the 5 families, the commission, the territories, the rules, ran for another 53 years. It survived the Kefauver hearings. It survived Valachi. It survived Appalachian. It survived the deaths of every man who built it. It was finally broken in a federal courtroom in 1986. In a case named after the governing body Luciano had created in 1931, Congress gave American organized crime 13 years of guaranteed monopoly on a product every adult in the country wanted, and then took the product away. By then, it was far too late. They had already learned the only lesson that mattered. They had learned that the product was never the business.